on cultural heritage restitution, I would like to really thank our partners, Africa No Filter, for the support towards this work. This work would not have been possible without their support. As you read the journal, you realize that it's dominated by journalists as well as emerging researchers and people from the creative sector articulating a position on cultural heritage in Africa. You'll also notice that it takes a Pan-African perspective in terms of making the claim on behalf of our people, and therefore really want to thank Africa No Filter, and we'll be listening in a moment to our friend Natasha in a moment. I also want to recognize a dear friend who is in the audience, Lillian Wamboi Shege, who's really been a champion with us in this journey of social change. And therefore, again, Lillian, really, thank you so much for being with us today. Lillian works with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisor, and she is based in New York. And it's just coincidental that she happens to be in Nairobi, and just 2 days ago got back to Nairobi, and she's with us today. So just again, very briefly about Twaweza Communications. We are absolutely committed as an institution to knowledge production for social transformation. That is where we try to sit, that we contribute in the generation of knowledge so that our societies can become better, more inclusive, more equitable, and more democratic. That is really, really key to us. To do that, of course, we also do advocacy on those areas of work that are critical to us. So we do advocacy for artistic freedom, we do advocacy for freedom of expression, we do advocacy for media, freedom and so on, because we are an arts, culture, and media institution. So we work in those areas very, very deliberately for the sake of our people. In this particular case, we are contributing in the shifting of narratives about Africa, narratives that are detrimental to the continent and sometimes which have taken center stage globally, and yet they do not represent Africa as Africa should be represented. And therefore, we are contributing in this shift of narratives by amplifying very, very specifically Africa's contribution to knowledge and cultures. It's sometimes very interesting that in the Western tradition, they try to suggest that culture is not important. And when you look at the ways in which economic development has taken place in the West, it's taken place on the basis of cultural thinking. So, philosophies of individualism driving their economic work. And yet that's actually a cultural positioning. It's a cultural positioning. Individualism is a cultural positioning from the global north. In our case, it's much more collectivizing and much more working towards community, and that should never be seen as weak. It's a legitimate narrative of the ways in which societies should be organized by being more inclusive, being more community-centered. Now, also to say that we have complete commitment to the Pan-African approach to transformation. We believe that the African people ought to work together collectively. Despite our diversity, we take the diversity as a strength, not as a weakness, and that together we can actually contribute in changing the continent. So we take a Pan-African approach, and again, the journal that we are launching today does take that approach. We are shifting the narrative on restitution as part of continental responsibility, not a favor to Africa, but really as a responsibility by those of us who are able to question perspectives from the North. So it's a continental responsibility, and that's why we take the Pan-African approach. Finally, just to share that this journal was preceded by two critical convenings for knowledge sharing by the writers. Last year in November, the writers actually met online. We have writers from North Africa, South Africa, Francophone, Lusophone, and so on. And we met online and discussed some of the issues that you'll find in the journal. Those two knowledge sharing forums were very important because we learned things that we didn't know before about the pillage of African artifacts, as well as the ways in which communities are demanding that what belongs to them should be brought back. So before I ask our partner, Natasha Kimani, to step up, I would like to, I'm reminded that we do have a hashtag for the event today. The hashtag is, we have two hashtags, Jahazi Lounge 2022, that is the hashtag for the lounge, Jahazi Lounge 2022. And I think that there is a second hashtag, restitution. So we have Jahazi Lounge 2022 and hashtag restitution, and I think that these are going to be the dominant hashtags, and I think that we can be very active online, again, to say that this conversation is also taking place through the Twaweza online channel. I want to now ask Natasha to say a few words about Africa No Filter and anything else that you would like to share with us. Natasha, please. One moment. Maureen, Immaculate, rather. Yeah, please.
I hope it's okay for me to speak with my mask. I have a beautiful smile, I promise. My name is Natasha Kimani, and I know politicians say they'll keep it short and they don't. I really will. And I just want to say a few things about Africa No Filter, who we are, and why this matters to us. Professor, thank you so much for this, and congratulations. Are there any other contributors to the journal here with us? I just want to say congratulations. Can we just see who you are? Congratulations to the amazing work you've done, really and truly. Africa No Filter is a not-for-profit organization that focuses on shifting harmful and negative stereotypes within and about the continent. And we believe when we invest our time, our money, and our voice to African storytellers and content creators, over time we will see that the stories that we read and consume are now evolving and have a more developed and nuanced take, as opposed to what we see. And it's a bit tragic because a majority of the things we consume are actually not developed by Africans. And I would urge you, and this is not just a promotion of Africa No Filter, to read more about what we consume in media and what we focus on. And 7 out of 10 of Africans who consume media consume international media, meaning the gaze and lens in which we view ourselves is not ours. And therefore the stories that are being told about who we are, how we are, is not through our eyes. And that is why we were excited to partner with Professor and his team, because this is something that we were hoping to do, not just in the 1 year that we've been doing what we do, but in the years to come. We are hoping that young people and people across the continent will begin telling their stories in their own way. Not in a way that is comfortable, in a way that is politically correct, but in the way that tells the truth about our history and about ourselves. And we urge you, not just as Africa No Filter, and again, I would like to recognize one of my bosses who is here, and the amazing work that they're doing with Rockefeller. Lillian, you could just wave to everybody. The real money makers. We are the small people, Africa No Filter. So often, every time when someone hears I'm from Africa No Filter, the first thing is like, can you give me money? It doesn't work like that. I really, really wish it did. In fact, I have a fatwa on my head about giving Kenyans money. So just an FYI, you know. But I think it is important to note and say that when we are reclaiming our cultural heritage, we are reclaiming ourselves. And when we think of it that way, we are beginning to see that our story matters. The imperfections of our stories, the different nuances of who we are matter in shaping where we are going. And we should be very unapologetic about reclaiming those stories, but most importantly, telling them in a way that matters to us. So congratulations, Professor. I am very proud of the work that you're doing. We are very proud as Africa No Filter to be your partner and to continue partnering with you in the amazing work that you've done. Once again, to everyone who's contributed to this, congratulations. This is phenomenal. I am super proud. This was one of the first grants that I gave out. So this is a very personal thing for me as well, because I love the work that you're doing, Professor. And when this opportunity came for us, you were like, oh my God, yes, this story is being told. So congratulations, sir. Have a lovely day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Immaculate is my colleague. She does amazing work. And thank you very much. I can see our friends, Hasita and the team, and of course, the Institute for French Research in Africa. We've been engaging the French Embassy on these matters because there are some questions that we would like them to answer. So we are engaging on these matters. But you know, really welcome. Really welcome. I would like to ask my colleagues to give us the opportunity to watch a short clip. Mary, is that you? So that we hear the voices of some of the contributors who are not in the room, but who are able to get into the room and to share with us their reflections on cultural heritage for this. So, are you ready? Thank you. There is the debate on restitution of cultural heritage, but this debate is taking place in Europe and only minimally in Africa. So that the debate is being driven by France, by Germany, and to a certain extent by Britain, but Africa is not engaged sufficiently in this debate, and yet it concerns Africa. And therefore, it's very important, in my view, as well as the people that we work with, that African journalists, researchers, academicians, civil society organizations, the private sector, and the government reflect systematically about the restitution of the North, so that we are part of the debate. We are not a footnote in the debate. We are at the center of the debate.
Place where the first piece of art was found, Nok. Because the name of the place is Nok, and it's in Kaduna State, which is just like a state next to the state that I am from. And it was a very interesting thing for the European colonizers at the time to find it, because there was this widely held mindset that Africa didn't produce art, and a lot of our art in that way came after colonization. So when they found it, it was like, whoa, and when after the first one was found in North, they went on to find it in many different parts, especially in northern Nigeria. And that was being able to have a place to hold all of that art is what led to our first purposefully built museum. It's called the Jos Museum in the state where I'm from, and it's still there today. You can, if anytime anyone is in Jos or Nigeria, you're welcome to come, and I'll take you there myself. But yes, they wanted to hold, we needed a place to hold the art, so they built that museum in 1952. However, we all know that a vast majority of our art is not on the continent, it's all over the place. So this is said to have existed a very, very long time ago. And so it was accidentally discovered exactly by miners in 1929. And since then, there has been a lot of looting, people illegally digging and selling these figurines. So we don't even know how many that we truly existed. We don't know all the places where they are because a lot of them were traded illegally.
The issue of restitution definitely is a complex process. And it cannot be done by one person or by one institution, one community. It has to be very inclusive. And it also has to have a coordinated approach because when you start talking about what should be brought back, it's not only objects. There are even cases where documents have been stolen. I think I was with a colleague just the other day in West Africa, and they were talking of even traditional music, narrations which were taken away from them. And if we do not bring inclusivity in the whole discussion, and particularly bring on board those stakeholders, the locals, the art collectors, whoever was involved, then we'll be missing a lot. And this is just an emphasis because I know we are all aware of this. It's not only sitting in our offices and discussing and deciding what should be brought and where it should be taken and what should be done with it. We need to bring each and every player on the table so that we discuss, and we should not also politicize, we should not commercialize, because I know there are aspects of where this issue is also being discussed because people see some issue of commercializing the whole process, and also maybe even compensation of those objects. So we need to be very clear when we are discussing and coming up with our policies on what we are asking to be brought back, how it will be brought back, what we will do with it, do we even know the provenance? And these are just issues that on a daily basis we have been discussing, but we haven't put them in our policies yet.
Because at the time, if you had an expedition, or if you did an expedition, you were allowed to keep part of your find, as long as you have to prove it's not unique, it's kind of redundant, and it has to be inspected. It has to be inspected at the Egyptian Museum, at the time by British authorities, not even Egyptian authorities. But what the German archaeologist did, Ludwig Burchardep, he basically forged a paper. He basically wrote it off as a mundane find, and even after writing off as a mundane find, even according to the laws which were colonial to begin with, even according to those laws, it should have went to the Egyptian Museum, was inspected there, and then came back to and then went back to the division. However, they decided, but records show, and not even like Egyptian records, German and Austrian records from the period showed that the bus never left the camp was Ludwig, and it actually, and then he took it with him outside, and then it went to the to the vault of the person who funded the expedition, Jack Simmons, and it stayed there for like 11 years until the significance, or basically the European craze with everything that's ancient Egyptian came out in 1922 after the discovery of the Tutankhamun tomb.
So thank you very much, Mary, and your team for putting that together. We heard from Nigeria, on the whole question of Nok art. Then we got to Egypt. Mohanad has a very interesting article in Jahazi, so I really want to encourage people to read it. He is a journalist based in Egypt. again, raising very, very important issues. So we'll be able to get that. The journal will be available after the launch, both online, in a format that everybody can be able to read. And then, of course, we got comments from the National Museums of Kenya and the gaps. At this moment, I want to invite, one of the editors of Jahazi, Dr. Caroline Mose, to run a short panel discussion on this issue so that we can start teasing out, the issues. And serially, you will discover that, some of the issues we discussed a year ago are actually coming out in a much more systematic way and really welcome. Cyril is the cultural attaché at the French Embassy, so it's really nice to have you here again to see how we are pushing this debate forward. Caroline Mose, Daktari.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of this issue of Jahazi. My name is Caroline Mose. I am a lecturer at the Technical University of Kenya here in Nairobi. And I would like to welcome our panelists to just join me. We have seats here that are very well spaced out. All protocols, all COVID protocols observed. I know some people, we would like to imagine that COVID is over. It probably is, eh? Still, we will still, so I'd like to invite our panelists.
It always looks funny if you just bring yourself.
No, you bring yourselves, please. Is it just us? Are you? We have three panelists. Welcome our panelists. I'll take the seat at the far end. And as I sit, I will ask each of our panelists, starting from my immediate right, please introduce yourself. I always want people to introduce themselves so that we know how they are self-identifying at that point. Please introduce yourself, and then we will take it from there.
Hello? Is it? It is? Oh, bless. Okay. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for spending your Friday afternoon with us. I just want to say that I've never smelled such fragrant hand sanitizer in my life. In my life. Like, all of them smell like despair and shame. This is interesting. It's like a little floral something. My name is Dr. Njoki Ngomi. I work with the Nest Collective. We've done a bunch of work just kind of exploring the whole thought of object return that kind of starts situating the object as a placeholder or as a symbol for the amount of power and the number of items beyond objects that actually do need to change hands quite urgently. And we are very proud to hold space for our ancestors who started this conversation decades ago. We're not the first Africans to ask for our things back. We will not be the last ones, but we intend to continue speaking loudly while we can.
Welcome, Daktari.
Thank you very much. My name is Lydia Muthuma. I'm actually honored to be here. And I'm one of those people who'd rather live and let live. But when we are discussing matters identity, it's difficult to say live and let live because it's me who's involved. So I have tried to ignore that question, and I've been trying in vain.
I must get involved. I don't have a choice. So thank you for inviting me here today, and I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Welcome, Daktari, welcome.
Hello, I'm Jambo. My name is Njeri Gashihi. I work for the National Museums of Kenya, and it's really an honor to be here this afternoon. I work as a research scientist, doing different things here and there, but for some reason, I kind of stumbled upon this subject that I wouldn't have wanted to be involved in, but as my fellow panelists have said, I couldn't avoid it, and I have been part of this community that is trying to speak and think like our forefathers would have thought. Just to quote Daktari's words, we don't know exactly what they would have wanted to say, but we are trying to see if we can even just say 10% of what that would be. Thank you very much, and welcome.
Welcome, Jerry. I actually read your article in this issue on the Dome. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly, Dome. And it was very fascinating, and I would encourage everyone to read it. Someone is laughing at me because I'm probably not pronouncing it very well. But that brings us to our first question. Why restitution? Why restitution? And this is open to anyone. We can start with Daktari Njoki. Why restitution? Why should these things, these objects, our people, why should they be returned?
So first of all, there's a lot of room for nuance in this long overdue conversation. The first is that we do have to recognize that not every single African object and this is not me doing not all objects, that's not what's going on. But in honesty, not every single African object in a museum abroad left by nefarious means, right? Not every single one of those objects is desired back home. There are some that are very specific that are desired home. The second thing is that it's not just objects we want. There's a veritable ocean of colonial records that detail the deaths of families. People might be there by name, people might be there by location, certain wrongs that were done to people over certain periods of time, so that then we can begin to ask properly for restitutionary action, which can be anything from reparations to some sort of formal recognition of the wrong done. We're also very aware, of course, as Africans, that a lot of these colonial records were destroyed. I think also the other thing to note is that a lot of times people want to focus on the back and forth of the object actually moving. And there's a lot of politics in the objects moving, and it will be great to hear Jerry talk about it, because she's much more familiar with the museum context and like the nonsense involved in trying to move an object. An object belongs to the museum, but the museum is an entity in trust to another thing, some sort of government, a thing like that. So the object technically is held by the museum, but does not necessarily belong directly to the museum. And so for an object to then move, there's a lot of paperwork that will need to be pushed, which tells you that the objects were actually transferred to be life prisoners. They were never intended to come back home, because the process was designed to lock them at their final destination. So for us to come and say we do not want those objects there is us coming to say we need to commute this life imprisonment, which of course, even for a person, is a long process, right? And that this is why our ancestors in the decades before colonization and after started to have this conversation and continued to push it forward. So now, when you put all of those things together, it becomes important that in order for there to be any remote attempt at a sort of understanding of how we sit when it comes to power, because in any other context, if I came to you and I told you that sweater you are wearing actually was taken from me, and there's proof, there could even be documentation of the story, and then in any other context, if we considered ourselves to be equal human beings, you'd say, oh, this is terrible to hear. What do we do now? because it's like, okay, now we have to talk about what happens when you're not wearing a sweater. And then I might tell you, actually, that's not my business. The sweater is mine, and I've come for it, right? Or the conversation about, so you'll be cold, what does that mean for you? If I'm feeling gentle, or, but that would require me to want to be part of that conversation. But truly, I only have to engage until the place of, that's my sweater, give it back. In any other context, if we were equal, it would be easy for you to give me back my sweater. But in the context we are in now, and even a child in a playground can tell you what Africans are saying: give us back our objects, our records, our everything to do with us, give it back. And people are saying, we can't, I don't know, it was such a long time ago, why can't you guys just forget, just make a new one? That conversation is proof of a power dynamic that is toxic and that is unjust. For the justice alone, it's important to have conversations about the restitution of objects, and that it must move beyond conversation, because we've been at conversation for the last several decades.
For a very long time, yes.
Exactly.
You've raised a very interesting question, and I would like to pose this to Lydia, where the sweater analogy, assuming you have evidence and you have paperwork, I have taken the sweater. But in some of these instances where we are demanding some of these objects to come back, that were taken from countries that didn't even exist before, like if you talk about the Benin bronzes, they didn't necessarily belong to the country of Benin. So what happens where we are having this conversation, these objects were taken, and at times I think we are being polite when we say taken, that the correct word is stolen, looted, there was thievery, there was robbery and theft. What happens when these, because I think there's a word for it, I think it's provenance, that, there's a root, there's evidence. What happens when there's no evidence, but then it's clear that this object does not belong in this country, in this museum? What happens in that case? How then do we move the conversation? And we need to move beyond conversation, but how do we move the conversation forward into, it doesn't matter whether or not there's clear, because as you say, some of the documentation was destroyed, and in other cases there was no documentation. These things were meant to go and not return. So Lydia, perhaps speak a little bit on that. I know it's a very long and loaded question.
Oh, I feel sorry for myself. Now, as she said, it's a simple matter of justice. If I have something, you use the sweater. If it is not mine, what am I doing with it? I should give it back to the owner. And you see, this question is a bit more emotive than just a sweater. Because what we're talking about is a people's culture, cultural heritage. Let me give a very simplistic example. Imagine if we took the shield of Koitalel Arap Samoei. He led the Nandi. So if you come and take his shield, and probably you take it to the British Museum and keep it there. Now, ordinarily, the way a museum operates, you're not just placing the artifacts there to be looked at, to be seen, and that is it. No, that's insulting to the people. What you want to provoke is a conversation, is a narrative between the viewer and the object. So the people who go to the British Museum, when they look at objects from the Nandi community, half of them don't know who these Nandi are. They don't have a clue who are Koitalel. You said Koita what? Yes, that's what they'll ask you. So eventually, if we can just skip to the end of that story, you're telling the story of how great and grand the British Empire was. We went, we colonized, we even collected trophies. This guy was just bothering us, so we asked Colonel Minetshagen, can you come? I don't know why somebody with such a German name was working for the King's African Rifles, but you're telling him, can you come and put this Nandi business, just finish it once and for all. So you go away with it, your only intention, correct me if I'm wrong, is to simply tell the rest of the world how mighty and how great and how you know, the colonial power was. And you know what? The empire is finished. You cannot sustain that story because from 1945, after the Second World War, the British Empire started exiting center stage. Why are you going to sustain a narrative that has been passed by time? Anyway, I mean, we can simply wait and see what happens in the next 20 years, but it will become irrelevant. But let's come back to Koitalel Arap Samoei. The shield was his. Imagine if you brought back that shield, don't even put it in Nairobi National Museums, take it back to the Nandi. You know what? Like every other human being, he has a family, he has descendants. Where are his sons and his daughters and their children? They would be so proud. They would feel complete to have the shield of their grandfather. Whether he was beaten by the British or not, that's not the point. For them, the shield of their grandfather is a part of who they are. So for somebody to sit in a museum, to be in charge of a government telling me there's provenance, there's no provenance, we can't tell, all those are stories. Just cut it short. I mean, who does it belong to? If it belongs to Koitalel Arap Samoei, it should be where Koitalel Arap Samoei is. And apart from the narratives that are attached to those artifacts, apart from them being overtaken by time, they can also be false. Because if the only thing you can do is tell me that Koitalel was beaten by the British, is that all there is to say about the man? I mean, that's a very simplistic way of looking at things. There's a lot more that made Koitalel who he was. If you remove an artifact from its context, you're beginning to distort the story. It is not possible to collect the whole of the different Kenyan communities and deposit them in Britain or in France. It's just not doable. We can talk papers, we can say diplomatic this or the other, but that is neither here nor there. Once those artifacts come back to the people they belong to, the story will be enriched. The conversation will have substance. It will no longer be, they've come to the museum, I am the tour guide, I need to tell them, who did you say this shield was from? What was that name again? You know, it's a fabricated story. But if it's here, and mind you, one of the reasons why some people don't want the artifacts to come back to Africa, they actually very paternalistically say, the Africans may not look after their own heritage well. I mean, their words I can't even repeat. I can't say them loudly. It's an insult. There isn't another way of saying it. So give them back to us, whether we want to put them in a museum or to put them in the cowshed, that's our business. If she brings back the sweater, whatever she does with it, she might use it to mop the floor in her house, that's up to her. Because, again, she mentioned something very interesting. Thanks for that, Daktari, that it's a question of being the same. If we all have the same humanity, we are all equally human beings, then why should I keep your heritage? It belongs to you, it's yours. What am I doing with it? That can only happen if, for some reason, I assume that Daktari here is subhuman. That's why she'll not be able to look after her own heritage. She will not even understand it. You know, she really doesn't have the ability to know who she is or to negotiate that relationship between herself and her grandfather and her peoples. It's a very emotive subject, and I'd rather not go into greater detail because it just beats me.
Yes.
The lack of logic, yeah.
Okay, so you have spoken about objects, and you've actually mentioned the shield of Koitalel Arap Samoei. and Doc, you spoke about documents. We'll come back to something that is actually in the first section of this issue. But for you, I would like to focus a little bit on the museum, because they've mentioned that in what they've been saying. So if you speak to some people who are asking for their objects back, they would wish for these objects to end up at the museum, because it becomes a central point for the stories which were lost. Because one of the things that happened when these objects were taken is that the stories that they carried with them, the stories they embodied, got lost. So they would want these objects to end up in the museum. And in this case, I'm referencing the spear of Karambu Olesenteu, where one of his descendants says, it's okay if it comes to the museum, because then Kenyans don't know the story about how the Maasai actually stood up to the colonialists. So it would be nice for that shield and the spear to end up at the museum so that everybody can have access to that story. On the other hand, we also know that museums are in many cases and in many contexts colonial libraries with that colonial baggage. So my question to you then would be, how do we begin to decolonize the museum, and what would be the new, or maybe the, I don't know if new or advanced positionality of the museum in the conversation around restitution, so that we are not bringing these objects back to come and replicate the same power structure here on the continent or in our countries? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. You've asked me a very complicated question, but I will try to tackle it. Let me say this, that the two scenarios, you've talked about as one scenario of a Maasai spear that should come back to the museum. But I also want to point out that we do have a scenario where communities are very particular about their objects not coming to the museum at all.
Exactly.
And I'll give a case of the Pokomo drum. The Pokomo drum, which was the power, or is the power structure, everything, it has the spirit of the Pokomo people, is something that I even would not want to touch. I wouldn't even want to see it. I am a museum professional and I wouldn't want it in my store. I'm not saying this because it is bad, but it's because I believe that an object is not just an object, and I want to give this analogy. And I want to talk about Prof and your shirt. What is the difference between that shirt now and when you bought it? Is it the same? Exactly. Exactly. Because that shirt now has the scent of Prof. It carries Prof around. So at times when I see it, I'll see Prof. I am using him because I've never seen him again. Lest you say that I'm saying he wears the same shirt all the time. But that's exactly what I am talking about, that an object is not just an object. It has a soul. It has a story. It has something else that it's beyond the physical. So when I talk about some objects, and some of these that I even would not even feel like it's okay to call them objects, they are souls. They are so sacred that they even scare me as a museum practitioner. So look at those two scenarios. So what I'm talking about and what you've asked me is a very important question. And let me say this, that even as the National Museums of Kenya, we are not saying that we are fully decolonized. We are saying that we are working towards that decolonization. It's important because you know how we've been founded. In our history, we have our colonial background with us. We have this that we have always inherited, and something that we may need to work on. That is why we still have our bureaucracy. We have borrowed this here, we borrowed that here. But actually, the museum we are talking about, the decolonized or the new museum, is a museum that can negotiate with Prof and ask him, I have this shirt that I found, I don't know how it was lost, I found it, what would you like me to do with it? This is the museum we are talking about, the museum that allows the voices of people to come out, a museum that invests in making sure that they know exactly what the community would want with their objects, a museum that is so open-minded to a point of looking like it is almost not functional. You know what I mean? Is when my colleague here talks about letting people throw their spear in whatever, in dung or whatever they want to do it. And it is so important because he could have the shirt and I would think it's really nice, it's precious, I found it for you. But do I know whether he still looks at it the same way? Maybe it is not potent anymore. I'm using potent because when we are talking about objects, some of them are so potent. We are talking about ritual objects. We are talking about sacred objects. Just like I wouldn't pick any kind of crucifix from a church and start doing whatever I can do with it because I know it means something to somebody. The same I would want to see the museum treat objects. And by this I mean it has to go as far as even looking at who handles these objects. Are they qualified? If an object is not supposed to be handled by somebody who is not circumcised, who am I to even get near it? Can we respect that objects are not just physical? So for me, that is my pledge and that's my prayer. I don't know whether I'll be there to see that kind of a museum. I do not know whether it will be there in this time, but what I'm saying is that this is exactly what we are looking forward to. And maybe it's going a little bit back to a question that has been discussed by my friend, if you allow me. We are talking about a thief. Let me just use a thief. Mwizi in Kiswahili. A thief. Moishi is in my language. It is a very serious issue that I steal, and it's as if that is not enough, I erase anything that cannot connect me with that kind of theft. What is worse? So if you tell me that the provenance of something cannot be found, then what are you saying? I think I'm a worse criminal. So if you have done something that can make an object not even traceable, I think you ought to be punished more. Because it means you have not only committed one crime, you've added another one onto it. Because I don't think there's anything in this world, even when we are talking about IP issues, intellectual property, nothing guarantees. If you paid me to be here this afternoon, I have not been paid, by the way. If you paid me to be here this afternoon and you took something and used it against me, there's something I don't lose, my moral rights. I am a human being. So can we recognize this and think about this as if, wear that shoe of the person who is thinking about how a whole community lost its power structure because somebody thought it was not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
I want to leave it there.
Mm-hmm. You've spoken about objects, and there's an article, objects which are sacred, and there's an article in this issue about the vigango, which were carvings that were placed on graves. And so they became a doorway into the afterworld, because if there was a problem in the community, people would gather around that kigango and they would want to speak to the ancestors and to the spirits for a solution. And now these objects, I think, are somewhere in Italy. I'm not quite sure where they are. So my question comes back to, we've spoken about objects, we've spoken about documents, we had on the video about recordings and music. I want to go back to what is in the first section of this issue, where we're saying bring back our people. And when we say bring back our people, we are talking specifically about human beings, either who are taken as live humans, to be displayed in freak shows and human zoos in Europe, or we are talking about body parts that were taken. There's an article about Mangimeli, who was a Chaga chief, and he was hung, and then his body was, his head was chopped off, and his skull is now lying in a museum in Berlin. Let's talk a little bit about that.
That's macabre.
Yes, it is. The idea that you can kill someone and then chop off their head and then take the skull and you display it somewhere, and then you've left the body here. So even that spirit is very disembodied in that sense. But let's talk a little bit about that. The propensity of our former colonial powers in taking body parts. We've heard the story of Sarah Batman, who was taken and actually was returned, I think in 2001. And she was in bits and pieces. After she had passed on, her brain was in a jar and her other body parts were in jars, and scientific studies were being done on her, quote unquote. Let's talk a little bit about that. When we say bring back our people, what has been the impact of that kind of of taking, because this is not just taking of an object that is sacred, this is taking of a body. And usually these were either chiefs or they were, you know, they were medicine men and medicine women, etc., etc. Let's talk a little bit about that. And this is now open. Anybody can speak on that.
Maybe I can go first.
Yes, please.
I think it's crucial to note that, and I know this also because of hanging out so much with Jerry when we were doing the Invisible Inventories project, that museums, especially, because they're not the only holders of human remains, but museums very specifically have become a lot more progressive than they have been. And to be fair, it's difficult for things in museums to move fast. They really take their positions of being holders of the archive very seriously. So if you're going to come and say, hi, we are coming to threaten the archive, it takes them a while. But at least with regard to human remains around the world, there's a growing kind of realization that it's not on. Like, nobody is keeping human remains, and if you have human remains in your store, there's a problem, you know? So we're not there yet with other people's objects, and I can go into why later. But with regard to human remains, there's a lot more active conversation around the remains needing to go home and the remains needing to be buried very specifically. This is for the remains whose whereabouts we know. There's some very specific remains whose whereabouts are not known, or at least are not being confessed by the people who are holding them. One is, of course, the late Koitalel Arap Samoei, who also was beheaded, and whose head was also taken away. And that one, nobody knows where his head is. And his family have gone to search. They've gotten lawyers to look in the UK. It's been a fruitless search so far. I personally believe that this is not a conspiracy theory, it's just the truth. There's some things people know where they are. They know, they're just not saying. I think it's also because of fearing the pushback. You know, but I'm like, also, all of us watch movies. You can put a thing in a box and leave it somewhere, you know, and then run away. I don't know, but whoever is holding onto that kind of remain is holding onto it very intentionally. I don't think where we've gotten to in life at this point in time, it's possible to not know that what you're doing is wrong. There's definitely also been a kind of distancing of global North citizens from the cruelties and the evil deeds, because these are evil deeds, there's no other word for them, from the evil deeds of their ancestors. And it's like that, it wasn't us who did, but I mean, here we are, right? This life that you live compared to the life that I live, the comparative value we have in this world, the fashioning of this world around values that kind of prop up white supremacy, all of these things were arranged by your ancestors for us to all collectively live the fruits. So we are in this soup of nonsense together until it's done, right? Because also blackness is only viewed relative to non-blackness, not in any other way. And we are not equal because of the ways blackness is viewed. So I don't want to comment really on the kind of the details and the rubric of the evil deeds that were done. I think any power that is unchecked will always behave like that. And you can see it in the ways that, for instance, patriarchy works in societies and the violence that's done against people who are marginalized by gender. You can see it in the ways specifically that queer people are treated by the general kind of heterosexual identifying public. You see it in the ways that poor people, unhoused people, immigrants, people who have more kind of shaky positionality compared to other people who are more stable. You see that kind of power acting in that way. And you see the ways in which cruelty then kind of will always 1000% follow unchecked power. And so for me, it's not just a thing around race, even though race is a very key factor, and that race also checks in with a lot of these other things that I've already named. But it is the way power works. And as human beings, we should ask ourselves the ways in which we understand power, the ways in which we are socialized to understand power, to exercise it when we have it, or to treat people who are powerless, because it is a socialization, and it is held up by culture, it is held up by religion, it is held up by statecraft and state practice. Is that right? You know, where does that sit morally? And not just a conversation, what do we do to actively challenge power structures? Because when they are not checked, this is what happens. We are left with human remains of some people who are not even being treated like human beings because they were not considered human beings, so that their remains would stay on one side of the world, and then their descendants would be pleading. Can you imagine having to plead with somebody for the remains of your ancestors? It's ridiculous. And that even for us as Kenyans here, we do have to negotiate with those things with regard to how have ethnic supremacies exercised themselves in this context. Which tribes are placed in certain ways, which tribes are owed certain things. Why is that? Because that is how this nonsense of power begins, and begins to entrench itself. Anytime when power goes unchecked, a family, this thing of unquestioned, the father is the head of the household, which then leads to people being abused by whoever is the head of the household and people not being able to say anything. Unchecked power is the problem.
Right. Any, would you want to add something, Dr. Ari?
Yes, just a footnote that it is true when today's people argue that you cannot inherit guilt. That was those were our forefathers. I wasn't there when they were doing all those things. I'm not the one who killed Koitalel. I'm not responsible for putting Kimathi in an unmarked grave. So, I mean, I'm 5 generations removed. I agree with them totally. However, much as you may not inherit guilt, you do inherit responsibility. So they can argue whichever way they like, but they are responsible. And then you asked a few questions. What should we do about it? You know, somebody somewhere knows where those remains are, or somebody somewhere wants to hold on to some, I mean, human dream. It's even difficult to just articulate it. We are the same society that is so busy going on about, oh, democracy, intellectual property rights, many catchphrases. I think for all those, call them powers, call them states, call them whatever you want, call them museums, they ought to repair, pay some reparation money. If you have royalties from that museum and half the merchandise there is not yours, take those royalties to the people who it belongs to. If you're busy showing the Nok sculptures, the figurines, take the royalties to Nigeria, northern Nigeria. If they are Koitalel shield, bring the royalties to the Nandis. So there are possible ways to repair. Of course, if you have body parts, you should bring them on your knees. Not just in any other way. You bring them very sorrowful, assist, do anything to heal that family, and then perhaps we can talk about moving on. Mm-hmm. But we can't hide behind the fact that, oh, it was so long ago, those were different people, I'm not the guilty one. Yeah, but there's something you can do about it. Thank you.
For you, Njeri, or did you want to add something?
I will just say one thing.
Yes.
That, and I think it came out, that we do have this situation where we kind of hide behind institutions. We hide behind politics. We hide behind laws. Who cares? I do not think there is any single law that talks about you keeping somebody's body in your closet. I do not know of one. So even when we try to so much, we've had it all. You know, the law, you know, you have to go to, I don't know, we have to ask. You see, we are not the ones with the powers. You know what? We are the people. We have to make the decisions. So if you are in a position of power, you need to make that decision now. You know, time is up for you to hide behind, you know, all those are just games. Let's just do what needs to be done. Mm-hmm. Let's just be right.
Right. You spoke about nuance, Njoki, and we want to bring nuance to these conversations right here. There are some objects that have been returned and objects that are being returned. So we are not saying that objects have been stuck and they've not started coming back. Some have been returned. I think, was it last year or the year before, that Jesus College in Cambridge returned the cockerel, the bronze cockerel to Nigeria. So there are some objects that have come back. I want us to talk about the challenges that present themselves in this return. And I'll give an example, which may not make us look very good. A museum in the US, I think the Museum of Chicago, wanted to return some objects. And I think part of that consignment was the Vigango that I spoke about earlier. And when they reached the port, the Kenya Revenue Authority asked for a very hefty fee because this was so-called import duty. So, and the museum on the other side said, wait a minute, we are returning your stuff, eh? We've been holding on to them. We are now joining the conversation as your allies. We want to give you back objects that were stolen through Italy into a museum in the US. And KRA was adamant. They said, this is an importation, we need money. And so either the objects went back, sat in the airport, I think in Texas, for a long time until somebody from the museum, I think it was Dr. Cura, who actually intervened, and the objects came back. But we understand that these objects are lying somewhere in Mombasa. They were just like thrown in the corner. So these are some of the challenges we're talking about. So how do we, first of all, what are some of the challenges? And I'm posing this to you, but that I'll open this up to all of us. What are some of the challenges beside this? And how do we overcome them? Because it would beat logic for us to demand for the return of these objects. Only for them now to start having these problems, KRA and all these taxes, etc. The issue of them lying somewhere in Mombasa might be a different issue because maybe that's what the owners of these objects wanted them, that's how they wanted them. But what are some of these challenges and how can we overcome them? And not just in Kenya, we're talking about in terms of the entire ecosystem on the African continent and in the global north as well.
Wow, thank you very much. That's like really being put on the spot. But I will try to respond and talk about a few challenges. And I would like to start with the one you've talked about, the Vigango lying in Mombasa. They are in a store. That is actually one of the challenges that we have, which is what we call sensitization. Most of our Kenyan people, most of the community members, we are here in Nairobi talking about restitution and all these wrongdoings, but at times it has not gotten to where it belongs. And this is not because it is their fault, it's just because that's the way at times how things work. Remember, we are talking about a community or people who've been disengaged from something that belonged to them for decades. So, and with that has come a lot of other things. It has come with what I would easily just call, because that's what it is, brainwashing. Because there's this fear of thinking that this is going to make me unholy. Because I am a Christian, I should not be believing in those things. We still have those things. We cannot hide our heads in the sand. So we need to do serious sensitization, talk to people and let them be aware. Some of them are aware, but how many of these know? So sensitization is one of the challenges that we are having, because we have to bring everybody at the table. You had my director talking about inclusivity. We are here in Nairobi talking about it, but who else knows about it? So we still have a lot of work to do as a museum, as a community. Everybody has a responsibility to make sure that this debate that we are having here in the city gets to the core, to the people, because it is just going to resort to the same of bringing things and bring them to the Nairobi Museum. And actually, National Museums of Kenya does not even have space to accommodate most of these, which is one of the challenges. Then that takes me to the second one, where we have issues of resources. We are a country, of course, we know we have our own issues. We have little problems here and there, but of course we are getting out of them. But of course, she has talked very nicely that if you've been correcting with royalties on something, you have a responsibility to make sure that if it comes back, you can also accompany it with something that can make it look the way it should look it is a moral responsibility. That's the least that I can talk about, because this is what you have been benefiting in. But that also brings me to another question, that we also have a serious case also as a country. This is pointing to us. We do not have a policy. We do not have a regulation. We do not have anything that guides what happens where. And my friend here can attest that we've been through stuff, even with her, like exchanging me emails and saying, okay, so now what do we do? Because, well, we are here at the museum, as the museum, but we must recognize that, of course, we are doing a good thing. We are trying. We have these debates and we're having conversations, but we have not put in place the policy and the framework. And this is not only a museum work; it's actually a national, a national kind of thing that has to be put in place, so that we know that when this happens, this is what happens. And that must have been the case for Vigangos just landing in the airport, and then somebody does not even understand what it means. You see the sensitization I'm talking about? Do those people who are there even know what these Vigangos are, or they think there's some artworks that somebody has sold or something? You see, because we are not aware, so we need to create more awareness. I will only leave it at that because I cannot exhaust the list, but I know my colleagues can talk about other challenges as well.
Yeah, I want to pick up from where she left off, because there's a couple of other things that kind of create this ecosystem of dysfunction. I think the first to note is that a lot of these Vigango were used and have been used, and several objects, in many ways in some museums, are used as stores of value. Okay? So when somebody goes to check the value of this thing online, because somebody somewhere used it for money laundering, what, and this happens with art objects everywhere across the world. It's not just on African objects which were looted and are now being returned. It's like paintings, because art is in the unique position of a painting of me can be 100 shillings, it can also be 10 million. Yes. There was a painting 2 days ago that somebody drew eyes on, in some museum somewhere, I don't know which country, one of them. And that, I think that painting was worth, I don't know, 700 and something million somethings. It was a lot of money. Yes. So in that way, art is and can be a store of value. It can be turned into a store of exponential value as it moves across owners. And definitely there's a very, very thin line between a museum object and the black market when it comes to people being able to use, and art collectors. So there's a lot of shady stuff there. And this is not to say that all museum objects are stores of value in the same way, or all objects held by private collectors, etc., but there's stuff there to unpack. So with regard to the Vigangos appearing and people saying, we should charge them tax, they're not coming from zero, and they're not being ridiculous. There's a basis. And this is not me saying that KRA always have sense. That's not it. I'm just saying that with regard to this tax situation, there's definitely a thing there. Mm-hmm. I think with regard to capacity, and my fellow panelists have very ably kind of put that across. I always, and it is because of our work with Kinanjeri that now I can say this with confidence. If we're going to point at African museums as, you don't have a store, you don't have a store where you can turn a dial and then all the light becomes dim and the room is cold and what, I would really like to point out the word provenance that was used here. Yes. The provenance of these African objects that are abroad is dismal. If it's anybody who's lacking capacity, it is these European museums. They don't describe us properly. The object is not described properly. It doesn't even have the right name. They use derogatory names for the tribes. Sometimes it's just called African object, as though there is any such thing. There's all sorts of holes and nonsense in the provenance with regard to, so if anybody is lacking a sort of capacity and needs capacity building as done by Africans, it is these museums who are holding African objects. So if it's going to become a fight about capacity, we can really go and punch beyond our weight when it comes to capacity. I think when it comes to a conversation with people on the ground, Jerry, and I rarely disagree with you, I feel like the people on the ground have a much greater understanding of how a foundational injustice works. There's a lot of clarity about things having been taken, and that those things having been taken is tied very directly to the intense, tangible material needs that the people have now. They know that these things are connected very deeply. If you just go and ask people, like when you think about colonialism, what comes to mind? Like the things Kenyans will tell you are intense, you know, and very, very emotive, like she said. And so I think the conversation needs to be, how does this object coming back home shift our realities materially? Because that is a conversation Kenyans can get involved in, right? We're the same people who will raise money together for one of our babies to go to university. We raise money together to pay off somebody's bills, because we are all kind of in a soup of struggle in different ways, some people far more than others, and a vast majority of people far more than others. So the real conversation here is about the value that having these objects brings to these museums abroad, because they would not be holding on to them if they did not add value to them. The presence of these objects increases the value of the museum industry. The presence of these objects allows museums to say, we need to expand our stores so resources move towards them so that they can become a bigger museum. Then in 5 years' time, they then write a letter to say, please declare us a universal museum. See how many objects we have. And our Pokomo drum is there among those objects that they are citing. This Pokomo drum, which has never been put on display, so they can't even say they're holding it to show. That's not it. It's been in their store for 100 years, right? So it allows them to say, we need money for research. We have so many objects. We need to learn about them. It allows them money so that they can hire professionals like you and you and you. They can hire an artist like me to come and say, I need to be inspired. I need to be inspired by these objects. And I want to go and look at them and see the journey that now they have money to do that because they're holding on to our objects. All of that is money that is not here. It is not in Jerry's museum. It is not hiring you. It is not hiring you. It is not moving from my government to the museum so that then the museum can actually invest in growing a museum industry or an archive building industry, or an understanding, a collective understanding, even public education, like she's talking about. That's the value that we're talking about. And the minute you tell Kenyans that when we bring these things home, there are very many possibilities here with regards to the things that we can study, the ways that money can move, then you won't have people who are kind of not engaged with the thought. And maybe let me finalize with one thing. And it's with regard to museum policy. I feel like we've passed the place where one national policy is going to be enough. Definitely, and I know AFRICOM, which is the African Council of Museums, have had long conversations over many years about what can it look like to have like a global kind of policy around objects coming back. And please remember, it's not only Africans struggling with objects returning. Even the Greeks have been knocking at the door of the British Museum saying, kindly, we have marbles here, return them. You know, indigenous people in Australia, indigenous people all over the world, in South America, yes. Exactly. All of them are asking for their objects back in multiple ways. So it's time now to start thinking in a more macro way, to start understanding these things at a much larger level, even if here for ourselves, we definitely do need all of these other things that have been pointed out. I do want to say also that it does not behoove us to be good at receiving our objects. We are not scoring A. So even if our objects come and they stay and there's a mistake, we are allowed to make mistakes with our things. They are ours. I'm not going to have us pointed at by the global north to say, oh, look, they're even bad at receiving the objects, so we shouldn't return them. I'm sorry. Is it your object? Who are you to judge? No. So even if we are bad at it, imagine they are our objects.
It's okay.
They are ours. Yeah. So we'll be bad at it and we'll get better, but it's on our own time, in our own way, not judged or dictated by anybody else.
You've spoken about resources, and someone is pointing at me, telling me we are running out of time. You've spoken about the money, and I think the money issue is something that we need really to talk about, because I give an example of the Rosetta Stone, which appears in our issue. I understand this is the most visited object at the British Museum. So the amount of value that you're talking about, and maybe that is part of the reluctance to return these objects, because at the end of the day, we live in a very capitalistic, it's a question of capital. I will ask us to make our parting shots, because we have run out of time. Very quickly, 2 minutes or so each. Parting shots. Let's start with Daktari, because I did not give you an opportunity to answer that, my immediate last question.
No, it's okay. I don't have too many things to say. However, it's not nice to end on a downward note. There's a lot that's happening. We are sorting out the cultural policy. And if anybody from government is here listening to me, please just detach sports from culture. It just never works like that. I know that we are online. Just do that like yesterday. Whether you are the new government, the present government, then we'll be able to move. Besides, we have devolved very many things. Eventually, culture will also be devolved. If the national museums do not have space, I mean, how many constituents, counties are there? There are 47. 47 different holding places. I mean, you think the Nandi will not have space for the shield of Koitalel? Try the Kikuyus. They won't have space for, they'll have. So we are doing something. We can only continue that way. But please remove sports from culture. And then that way, I might even vie, I don't know if people vie, to be the CS for culture. Yeah. Or promote one of these people here, and then we'll do something. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daktari. I want to reiterate on that. Please, GOK, detach culture from gender in sports. Tafadhali. There are people who are qualified, people who are knowledgeable, people who can work within would it be a ministry, or what would it be? A ministry of culture.
Yes, Ministry of Culture, yes.
We appeal to the government of Kenya. We will continue to appeal. Please do that, like Dr. Lydia has said yesterday. Tafadhali. There are many. These are people who we can, you know. She's looking at me like, no. But there are many qualified people who can actually run with this. Parting shots.
I think I'll try to make it very short, and just to say one thing, that the Vigangos that are lying in Mombasa are not there by mistake. Yes. The community of the Mijikenda community are already arranging, and they have even given land for us to make sure that those Vigango go through the process. And they have already laid out the rituals that have to take place, so that those Vigagos are incorporated into the community. So all is not lost. And when I say that capacity building, I mean, if we make every Kenyan, and this I mean every Kenyan, the number we are, know about everything that is theirs out there, I am so sure that we will not be sitting here talking. We will be on the street. That is, and I think that is what this country needs. We need to be pushed. Whoever is in government, and I know my museum is in government, needs to be pushed. Because if 60 million of us know about everything, I am sure we will not be sitting in our comfort and saying we don't have a law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Daktari, parting shot?
I really love this story. I really like when things unfold, even when it is slow and exhausting, but they're on our side, and because it's our business. So it is our business, what we do with those Vigango. It is the business of the Mijikenda people, what happens to those Vigango. I really enjoy that thought, and I enjoy seeing that policy in practice with the museums, kind of co-creating the path alongside the people directly. So not kind of visiting more imperial violence on them by saying, let the objects be stored along other objects. I do want to say that one of the issues I've been seeing coming up is this idea that an African object must be sacred for people to want it back. Actually, no. No. It can be an arrowhead. It can be the most mundane thing, but it is still ours. We still reserve the right to ask for it. Instead of having to put on top of it, it is sacred, then we come and perform Africanness to say, Africans need their sacred objects. No. That is true, but there are multiple truths. And one of those multiple truths is that not all objects have to be sacred, and we can still want them. There can be a trouser that somebody wore in 1902 or whatever, but it is our trouser. It doesn't even have to be special, but we are allowed to want it. So there's no need to enter this kind of squid games of morals where objects are competing to see which one is the most sacred. They're just all our objects, all of them. I want to close with that it is important for us to understand when we situate object movement, the ways in which power, and I go back to power, but I'll use kind of for the example for now, it's necessary to understand that the global north is the one that holds that power. The ways in which capitalist power operates around value, okay? And capitalist power wants to keep value. It wants value to move towards it, and it will not release it without a fight. Now, if you can count those three things, you want to keep it, you want to attract more of it, and you won't release it without a fight. You'll see that all those three things are true of our objects, right? You will see that all those three things are true of the COVAX that people only released when it was about to expire, right? That you want to hold on to it, even if it means that there are 72 doses per person in your country, you hold on to it until you can't. You want to get even more, which means that you are also represented in the line where people are buying. You have cut the line here, you are in the line here, you are in the line here, and when Africans want to join the line, they're told by the factory that we can't make anymore because there are some people who have 72 doses per person in the line already 3 times, right? And you can see that that's true in that sense. You can see that that's true of our best minds, right? That they want to keep as many as they can. They want to attract more, and that releasing them home is a problem, right? And creating the context, of course, where they can go back home and be safe to work at home and work at home for the value that they are owed is a problem, and they cannot leave because they are held by the ways value has been attracted in a particular direction. So our objects are being kept because they are valuable. That is the only truth. There is no other.
All right, please, a hand for our panelists, please. A hand for our panelists. Thank you very much for joining us and for your thoughts and for your wisdom and your knowledge. All I can say is thank you, and we look forward to, I personally look forward to having more of these conversations with you and to see how we can move beyond conversation, because we Kenyans have loved the word conversations. We have conversations about everything. We have conversations every day. Then how do we move beyond conversation into action? My parting shot is to say, one of my fellow editorial board members and I will be hosting a space on Twitter tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. We'll be opening up this conversation to anyone who is willing to join, anyone who is on Twitter. So please feel free to join in, ask for the mic, we'll give you the mic for you to speak your mind. Of course, we are launching the journal today. It would be very, very useful for us to dig in, for us to engage with these stories. Our chief editor for this issue will tell us that we deliberately removed this conversation away from academia necessarily. We started engaging people on the ground, people in the museums, journalists, and actually the descendants of some of the key figures whose remains are in the West, or whose the key objects were taken from. So that is what we did with this issue, and our chief editor for this issue will speak more on that just now. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us in this very important conversation that is going to turn into action. Thank you very much.
So let's give it up to them again for a fantastic, fantastic discussion. This is it. I mean, really, this is it. I mean, these are the questions. And of course, there is also a suggestion on what we need to do going forward. And with regard to the change of the ministry, I actually do remember writing an op-ed in Kenyan newspapers asking that, we should not have the Ministry of Culture as a Ministry of Sports, In fact, I had proposed that we call it the Ministry of Culture and Creative Industries, completely, you know. And that was before the last elections. I mean, we're trying to push, you know, the current government at that time. And we will do this. I mean, we have to continually do advocacy around this. And also just to let you know that yesterday, I had a meeting with the Director of Culture, and we are still pushing these ideas. I think we need to keep pushing these ideas consistently because culture is under-budgeted and under-facilitated at so many levels, and we need to go there. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have the special issue of Jahazi, and we have the editor of this special issue, Mweni Lundi, who has been really working very hard to ensure that we have a very energized issue. And it's an opportunity really to listen to her, to make some remarks about this issue, to also say that Mweni Lundi is an accomplished artist in her own right. She has mentored a lot of people, you know, in performance arts, and has been part of the journey of Jahazi from the beginning, when this idea, you know, began really with the late Bantu Mwaura. She's been really part of this journey, and therefore she has the history of Jahazi and so on. Mweni Lundi, karibu sana.
Thanks, Prof, for that intro. I'll start by just taking a step back and talk a little bit about our journey as Jahazi. As you mentioned, this idea started between Bantu Mwaura and Twaweza Communications. And the whole purpose of setting up the journal was to provide room. Where's Caroline, who said that we love having conversations? Yes, it was for purposes of having a conversation happening between practitioners, researchers, community, and a diverse group of people who would not normally be in the same space to discuss issues surrounding culture. That was the whole purpose of Jahazi. And another one, when you talk about community, I think the whole idea of, and this has been talked a lot about in our Kenyan space, the conversation between young artists or young cultural practitioners and those older, well-established practitioners, where we are saying that there hasn't been enough conversation going on in terms of the younger artists coming up, not knowing where all this came from, on whose shoulders do they stand, what was the work that was done previously. So this journal was supposed to be part of that, or to serve that purpose, as a way of documenting work that is ongoing for the future as well. So for me, it was an honor to be asked to join the editorial team at that point, and I'm still here, and will be for some time, while we can. So that was just the step back that I wanted us to take to know how far Jahazi has come. This special issue went a step further because with this special issue, we did something that we haven't done before. While we did a lot of work and compiled a lot of work from the Kenyan space, even with contributors from the diaspora who were mostly Kenyan, we were also, and had actually started intentionally by saying that we were not only going to talk about Kenyan cultural spaces and work, we were actually going to talk about the Eastern African space, because this is a space that is not talked about when it comes to matters art. So we were hoping that this journal will begin to make accessible that space for people to know what's happening in East Africa. So this special edition takes it even further, because you're thinking, one of the things that is being revived and getting new, a new vibrancy is Pan-Africanism. And for this journal, what we've been able to do is that we have received articles from different parts of the continent. We have articles from the north, we have Algeria, we have Egypt, we have Ethiopia, we have articles from western part of Africa. We have Nigeria, we have Benin, we have, I forget, Senegal and Senegal. We have articles from the south, we have Zambia, we have somebody from South Africa. Yes, and we have, again, we have from East Africa. We have Kenyan contributors. We have Ugandan contributors as well. The other thing that we're doing for the first time, when we started, because we were talking about the Eastern African region, most of our articles were in English, but we also had articles in Kiswahili, though we did not translate them and carried them as Kiswahili, articles in Kiswahili. For this edition, we have articles written in French, translated into English for the first time. And we hope that this will be a practice that will carry on into the future. And also what we've been able to do, we have been able to diversify our contributors. Originally, we've been looking at cultural practitioners, we've been looking at scholars, but more for this particular edition, we've been able to bring in communities where we have community-based organizations, where we have the media contributing into this space, so that it is not purely a scholarly, and this we have been saying since we started. And the reason why we were talking about practitioners, cultural practitioners, is that we did not want scholars or the academic space to be the only space available in the journal. We wanted this journal to be read by the practitioners as well, and not just read, but with their contributions as well. There are those who are practicing, there are those who will only look at the theory of the work, but bringing them together then expanded the space that we would be making accessible. So in this, we have diversified, we have added community, we have brought in the media, and we hope that our community, in terms of the space that we provide as Jahazi, will continue growing. And so, I'll talk very briefly because a lot has been said from the panel and by Prof in relation to what is in the journal. And as the panel started by saying, this is a very emotive subject. And yes, it was very emotive for us as well. Things that we agreed with, things that we totally disagreed with, that we're saying, okay, you write your own article, this is not yours, you can disagree in another article. But then let's look at this article the way the contributor really wanted to, what issue the contributor wanted to bring in. But what it also did, it made us take a step back in terms of what words are we using? What are we saying? If you're disagreeing with the narrative, what are the words that we've been perpetuating to deal with this, to deal with this issue? And one of the things then that was affected was the title of the edition of this issue. When we started out, we said, which is what is the normal phrase that is used? We talk about the return of African cultural heritage. But it took a step back and said, no. And we changed the title to reclaiming. Reclaiming, because if for us, this is a word that we wanted because we were actively going out and saying, it is our right. The sweater. It is our right. And so it made, for us, the use of the word makes it our responsibility in terms of claiming back and not sitting back and waiting to get these as loans or gifts, but we are actively seeking our right. So the title of the journal is Reclaiming our cultural. It is my sweater. Just because you're wearing it now does not mean it's yours. It is mine. Now, the journal then is divided into three sections. Depending, like you were saying, we talked about objects, we talked about, you're talking about body parts or remains, and we were talking about the issue around the infrastructure that is needed, the policy or legal frameworks that are needed in terms of getting back and keeping all that is out there that needs to come back. So, Section 1 is what we said is bring back our people. Like we said, we are not asking nicely. Bring back our people. What are out there that might be called remains, that might be called skulls, are people. And these people have families. These people come from somewhere. And when we don't return these people to where they should be, we have broken a circle. And when we break that circle, it's not just the family that hurts. It's not only the family that does not get closure. This impacts on the community to which that family belongs. This impacts on the country to which this person belongs. And so we are able to talk about a disconnected community. We talk about a deceased community as a result of these bodies, these people being held and kept away from their homes. So bring back our people. Here we have articles, one from Mozambique that talks about the issue of images, where it's not just bodies, the physical bodies, but they're talking about people who are carried to Portugal. Exotic, like you'd carry pets or animals. So the communities in Portugal could see these exotic beings. And photographs, and the exhibitions were held around them. And he talks about what does restitution for that kind of act mean? So we're questioning in ways in which restitution can be made. You carried people, you took photographs, you held exhibitions around them. Is it enough that you bring back the photos of what was done or the exhibitions that were held? Is it enough? So when you talk about restitution, when you talk about reparation, those are some of the, what will be enough to help the dis-ease, the disconnectedness, to heal these communities? We talk about, we've talked about the Vigango, we talked about Karambu, where a descendant actually asked a question that kind of just made us stop for a moment and think, okay, what are they doing with these bodies? Mangameli is an 89-year-old man who has been looking for his grandfather, is still waiting, has already had 2 DNA tests done. Did we need the DNA test when you have a family tree that points out who his grandfather was? And the people are still there? So what does it mean for these families once that body is returned? Is it enough that they will bury this cow that is being held? Is it enough? Zambia, they talk about the broken heel man, a skull again that has not been brought back. About 300,000 years old. But he also brings up an important question, which is, has the government asked for this to be brought back? Have they asked for their old man, for their ancestor to be brought back? Have they carried out their responsibility as a national government to be able to say, this 300-year-old ancestor belongs to us. He's part of our history. He's part of our community. This is where we came from. The story is written by somebody who talks to a teacher who was asking, we need evidence to be able to tell our children, students, that these people actually existed. It's not just a name. That 300 years ago, there was a human being here in this space. We didn't just come, we didn't just happen in this continent. We have been here. So how do we teach history when the evidence that we need to teach that history is held elsewhere? What do we show the children? Yeah. And we have, again, the question of another great man from Tanzania whose skull is also being held. And this actually is even, in addition to not just being held, it's, for lack of a better word, I'll call it, as Dr. Ngumi said, the conspiracy around bodies, skulls, disappearing, and suddenly nobody knows where they are. Were they misplaced? Is it a shoe that kind of got lost under the bed somewhere that nobody knows where it is? So how do you misplace human beings? And so that question, the question of what happened to these bodies that we cannot account for, the Kimathis, I keep getting that name wrong, so I need to read it. Makunganya. How do we find closure? How do we find closure when there's nothing for us to bury? And yet we know that these, as I said, these are being kept away intentionally. So, bring back our people. Nasi tafadhali. The next section is bring back our belongings. we keep talking about objects, and I think it was important what said during the panel about we want our objects back. And we keep referring to them as objects, yet in the same breath, we are able to say, they're not just objects. They're not just objects. They are imbued. They are imbued with the meaning of the people who held it, who made it, who used it. And so by denying them that, you deny them a part of themselves. So these belongings, again, because they're not just objects lying somewhere, they belong to somebody. It's not just stuff. It's not just things. They belong to somebody for a reason, and they need to be brought back. And this is a section where we have most of the articles under. From North Africa, where we talked about Egypt, who talk about the birth of the Egyptian Queen Nefertiti. We talk about the Rosetta Stone from Egypt. In Ethiopia, they talked about, and actually, I think there were 2 articles on the same issue, about the plunder that happened in the Palace Magdala, where somebody actually said that we cannot even list all the things that were taken there, because it is estimated that the things that were taken there were carried away by 11 elephants. I mean, not 11, 15 elephants. So there's also the question of what was taken. Do we have a list of everything that was taken? Do we know everything that was taken? Or are we relying on the lists that they give us that says, okay, this is what we have. This one we don't know that one, so here's our list. How much work, and this goes back to Njeri, what you said, in terms of the work that we need to do through the institutions that we have as a country. What's our government doing in creating that list? Do they know everything that was taken? Or are we just, when you said that we need to engage everybody, to what extent are we engaging the communities to find out what was taken from you? What do you want to claim back? What's on your list? So that was North Africa. West Africa, we talked about the knock art. We talked about there's an article about the Benin bronzes. Sorry, just to go back, something that came up with the Ethiopian, in relation to the Ethiopian stolen heritage, was the fact that, unlike maybe many other African countries, that they have started receiving some of the things that had been stolen. But then there was a question of how much, when you say at least things are coming back, at least, if we get 1 or 2 items from a list that has 100, is that okay? So there's a trickling back. There's a trickling back. And so there is a responsibility here that needs to be taken in terms of claiming for the full list. There's, Njeri talked about, oh, okay, maybe there's some things we don't want back. But they came from here, so why don't we just take them and then do what we want with it? Do we want to throw them? There are others, they are ours to throw away as well. So there's a lot in terms of what has been taken in relation to what is actually coming back. We talked about from West Africa, and in West Africa it was really interesting to hear most of the writers refer to a report that was commissioned by the president when he was coming into power, Macron, and they had he promised to return the stolen heritage. Very little has happened, and France has been quite silent on this matter. And most of the West African countries are saying those are all empty promises that were made. We have not seen much that has come back since that time. There's very little that relates to the report that has been fulfilled. So yes, we will ask and declare that it is our right to have them back. What happens if they don't keep their promise? What do we do? What recourse do we have? In my community, you have to be very careful where you steal from. Very, very careful, because the owner might find you there in the morning because you can't move. And they will call upon all manner of things to get their things back. They will be stuck in your hand, on your head, or whatever it is. That is with many communities. So I'm asking, what is our recourse? Do we call back our things? Is that the last recourse we have? Do we call back our ancestors? Join hands as Africa? And use all the powers that we have to call back our things, to ask them to rise and come back home. So we need to think, what is our recourse when this is not when the stolen property is not brought back? I cannot call each by name. We have 13 very interesting articles on our belongings that were taken and our take on how and these things should be brought back. There's always a question that is being brought to bear, of course, you don't have a place to keep them, what's your storage? Oh, we cannot transport them, they'll get damaged as we transport them. Or we can give them to you as on loan for a few months, and so on and so forth. When somebody steals from you, natural justice demands that you should not negotiate how this thing comes back to you. You shouldn't have to explain, oh, I will keep it here, I will keep it for, or even say, okay, yes, I'll take it back temporarily and then I will give it back to you. Because as some of the writers say, then what you have basically done is that you have denied yourself the right of ownership of that item. So how will you ask for it again after you have given it back? Because you're saying that that is the rightful owner. So bring back our belongings. The third section talks about voicing and capacity building. I know Njeri and Njoki had a different take on the whole issue of capacity building, but at the end of the day, we do need, okay, so first, we have to agree that these are our things. Where we keep them, when we get them back is, no, when we get them back is none of anybody's business. Secondly, these things that you took for safekeeping were somewhere already. They were being kept, they were being used. Keza Wilson talked, just to go back onto the belongings that were taken, Keza talks about the royal emblems that were taken when the King's Palace was when the King's Palace was plundered by the colonialists. And so since that time, because the stool, the drum, are the royal emblems that are used for coronation. And so because these items were removed, no king could be coronated. So no stool, yes, in Uganda. So no stool, no king. No drum, no king. And so it denies that community their king, their governance structure, their leader. And so when you talk about the capacity, in terms of bringing back the items, these things already were somewhere, they were being used for a purpose. And so in their return, we are looking at how will this be handled when they're brought back? The whole question that Njeri talked about, the decolonized museum space, what will that look like? Is it a structure? Is it an attitude? Is it a mentality, a perspective to life? Is it an ideology as opposed to a structure that we are talking about? What are the legal frameworks that we have? Like I said, what recourse do we have? What have we signed against in terms of international conventions, in terms of bringing these things back? And so the issue of capacity addresses a broad range of things, as opposed to, do we have a well-aired, well-lit room? And we speak of voicing because we say everybody needs to be put on that table for this discussion on restitution, to define what that restitution is, to define what that list is of the things that we want brought back, and so on and so forth. I could go on, but I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I'll do it from here.
Please do.
Go near the mic. You have met 3 members of the editorial team. Okay. You have met 2 members of the editorial team, and 3 including myself. Professor Kimani, Dr. Caroline Mose, We have a third member of the editorial team. Please just stand up so that people can see you. And she's the one when you were getting emotional about the articles and you're saying, yes, these are our things, they need to be brought back. Nasita Fadari.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And Faith Onair works with Nation Media. So she's a journalist in her own right. And it's really a privilege to be working, with this team. So we have people from academia, we have people from practice, and we have media and so forth and so on. So there are certain requests. I think we've gotten now to the point where we are going to launch the journal. And I would like to, at this moment, draw attention to some of the writers that we have. I would like to bring I think we have 3 writers in 3 contributors. We have contributors from all over Africa, but we have 3 in the room. We have Njeri, if you can come. We have Triza. And we have my vision. Dr. Dianga. Yeah, Rachel. Yes. Yes. I think that Dr. Ndianga has contributed briefly. If you could, I think that you could just say one word about just like in 1 minute about the piece. I know you have to just speak one. Teresa, if you could just like in 1 minute, just say what your piece is. And Jerry, again 1 minute about your piece, okay?
Thank you, Prof. Kimani, good to see you again in the new year, and good to see everyone. I have contributed 2 pieces, but I think I want to talk about one, which is about the Rosetta Stone in Egypt, which was taken under very interesting circumstances and lies in the museum in London, and it's very much guarded. So one of the questions I ask myself, how are you even going to get it? Like, we are going to have discussions, we love our conversations, but it's so guarded that for a moment it was actually taken to an undisclosed location so that it's not touched by the opponents during the World War II. So some of these things, you can see actually Africa, we are valued. Our items are valuable, but we are being made to believe that we don't count, we don't know how to take care of them. And so some of these stories are just meant to dissuade us from focusing on what we should be actually reclaiming. So I think that's all I want to say, Prof. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Othoni. My piece, I contributed a piece on Kiti cha Enzi. It's a ceremonial seat, like this one, not necessarily as plastic, but it's from Lamu, but it's currently housed at the British Museum. I came across the seat as part of a restitution project. We actually worked with Njeri and Juma, and I wrote about it before, and I wrote another piece which I submitted to Jahazi, and it is my hope that that particular seat will be returned to these coastal people, because it was a tradition that has since been discontinued because it doesn't exist here nowadays, and it's a seat that was actually found in each household at the time, but because there's nothing to look at and replicate, we don't have it anymore. Yeah.
Hello again. Shortly, my article is about dome, which is our wooden object. I really struggle not to call it a shield, but let me say shield shaped. made by the Agikuyu, and it was used on the night before circumcision. You can read more about it. But why this object struck me is that I came across it for the first time in 2010 at the British Museum. And then after that, it has it has been following me, because for some reason, every museum I go into in the Global North, I'm sure I'm gonna find one. So it intrigued me why one wooden thing would be in the wild just walking around. Why did it even go there? So for me, that is very interesting. My interaction with the community here kind of also brought another aspect where we know of people who've been trying to recreate one, who had tried but kind of did not really make it. But I must say, in the museum right now, at least I have confirmed that we have one. But so it is really something in terms of how it is and how there are many. A community amongst the Kikuyu, if you were doing a circumcision, there was one for every initiate, but you could not make it every time. So one ran through generations. It was, so you can read more about it. Let me not preempt. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a privilege to publish them. I mean, as I said, these are new writers for Jahazi, and it's become possible because of this special issue. So this is very important. We are now going to really launch the journal. We have a few hard copies. We created some few hard copies for people, and I'll ask Irene, do you want to manage us? So we have the editors. We have the editors. So you want the editors to come over? We'll have Natasha. And we have to have Lillian. Please. So, and do you have additional requirements? Yes. Please come, organizers. Our editors, yes. Thank you so much. Help us.